feels like it did it again, but anyway, all right.
We're
so
live.
Here we are. We're live. There we go. Welcome everyone. We're thinking we're good to go. Let's just do one more quick thing here. We'll go live on Restreamio. See if that works. All right, looks like we're live there as well. So Homa, I think we've made it again back to our online world here. It's exciting.
Outstanding. Good job figuring out all the Restreamio, Ecamm, Zoom, YouTube connections.
We continually are trying to add a layer of complexity to these things, you know, so that we so that we either learn or we fail. But either one of those is a learning opportunity.
It replaces like a longer line at the airport or a surprise in the parking shuttle bus. Right. That's what we get to do on Zoom.
Absolutely.
Yes, because we like Zoom and YouTube and all the platforms.
So should we give it one more minute before we get started? What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. People are checking in. They're saying hello. Very exciting. It is a snow day in Chicago.
No. Oh, come on.
We've got London and France and Spain and Chicago. Hey, Camille in France, in the beautiful part of the world you're in.
Lots of friends who are back for more punishment, as they say, right?
Seattle, we have a good geographic spread here.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. So what do you think? Ready to go?
Well, yeah, let's do this. Welcome, everybody. We are so happy to have you join us for what is a brand new offering from the Big Questions Institute. We have been really almost, I would say, captivated by the idea of storytelling and how storytelling can really serve as a path, as a means, and almost an end to school change. It is the tool, and in some ways, it's the result. And so we are going to sort of take you on this little learning journey with us to share some of what we have been sort of immersed in thinking about story. And to start us off, we'll just give a little overview of where we're going with this session. So, you know, we really believe that you, hold on a second, sorry, I'm having a little screen problem here. So you really can't write and tell new stories that are going to drive change without this array of words that begin with the letter C. And they are, we need to understand our contexts. We need to have coherence between what we believe and what we live. We need to be current. That's what we mean by currency here, that our work, our change, our stories need to be grounded in current realities, that we have clarity about where we've been and where we're going. And finally, that we can articulate commitments, that we know what they are, and they help us sort of chart that path forward. So as we think about this journey that we are headed on, we like to think about sort of navigating sorry, I'm having a little bit of, okay, sorry about that. That we are sort of embarking on this theme of storytelling for school change. And it really is both a manifestation and an expression of this theme, this disposition that we talk about all the time at the Big Questions Institute of fearless inquiry. And so when we think about story, it helps us to think about what that sort of uncharted water is and how we articulate it. And of course, I also think about stories that my children have grown up with, stories that sort of capture our imagination. And that is an element of story too. I think there is something sort of comforting and creative that is embedded in the process, and hence a few nods to some of our favorite stories that we or our kids have grown up with. And that everyone has a story, and everything that we do tells a story. And that is also really important, to acknowledge every life is a story. And this is a picture from Barefoot Books, the Barefoot Book of Children of the World, that I particularly love. And so as we think about, again, why story, it is important to recognize storytelling and story is a key to meaning making. And as we are living in this moment of crisis on so many levels, the coronavirus pandemic only being one of those levels of crisis, stories help us make meaning. They help us sort of zoom out to what's happening on the wider contexts, which we're going to talk about, zoom into our hearts and what is most important to us. It also, in terms of meaning making, our stories are global. Our stories are also hyper local. Stories help us build trust at a time when trust and truth telling are so scarce. Stories can serve as data. So, for example, when all of these Instagram accounts came out around the world in schools, the Black at Instagram accounts, recalling what it was like to be a person of color in a predominantly white institution, I take those stories, each one of those, as a data point. And when we do that,
Hey, Homa, hold on one sec, because I'm not sure why. We just lost you from the feed, so I'm not sure why that's happening. Um, Everybody's saying, we lost Homa, we need Homa back. So, and I only see myself on screen. Let me stop the share here for a second. And yeah, trying to figure out why that would have happened. Hopefully that's nothing to do with, I'll tell you what, let me take this off of, um, take this off of, um,
hmm,
apologies for this, everyone. This is learning at work as we go through this. So let me come back to Zoom and let me try resharing. Um, oh, there's no sound at all. Okay, so that's really interesting. So I just canceled, let me just cancel this too. How about now? Can you guys hear us?
oh, we're back on. Yeah,
Are we?
looks like
Are
we're
people
back
saying they
on.
can hear us? Okay, sorry about that. So this is
Can
what you
they
get for
hear us?
trying to use too many layers of technology. So Homa, why don't
Uh,
you say something and see if people can hear you as well?
okay, so did you all hear me when I talked about
I can see
stories
Homa.
as, yep, not
Hold
hearing
on.
me?
Yep. Okay. There we go. So now I'm going to share back the screen. Here we go.
Okay, so they can hear me. I can't tell. Okay, good.
Yep.
Helen,
You're good.
thanks for the feedback. Okay, great, great, great. Okay,
Okay.
so
Onward.
I don't know if you heard, but a really important component of why stories has to do with empathy, and it's a really powerful empathy builder, leading with empathy that helps us with design, with innovation, with equity, with inclusion. So what we want to do now is we want to hear a little bit, what is your story? What has been your story? Let's say over the last 14 months, how would you capture in a word or two your story? So what we want to do is take you onto menti.com, and you go to menti.com and you put in that code 39104199, and we're going to make a little see what magic shows up with a little word cloud. So we want to hear what's a word or two that captures your story. And I think this is such an important part of storytelling, is storytelling and listening. So we want to take a few moments to listen now. So go into menti.com, and then Will, are you going to be able to share the results on your
Yeah, I'm gonna look.
screen?
I'm looking at it right here, and remember, we're on about a 30-second delay, so we're gonna have to
Yeah.
talk over a little bit before people get there.
Okay.
While we're doing that, and then we'll check
Yeah.
back in.
Yeah.
While we're doing that, why don't we just mention
Oh, good
some of
idea.
the questions, and then we can go back to the Menti.
Yeah, good. So we also want to honor whenever we do the signups for these sessions, we are inundated with hundreds and hundreds, thousands sometimes, of incredible questions. We always ask, what is your big question that you're bringing to the session? And so we want to, just show you, like, here's the spreadsheet, here's what it looks like that we see on the next slide. Okay. And so we get all these questions. We understand it is not easy for you to read. So we just picked out a few representative questions so you can see on this slide. Really thoughtful questions. And so, for example, people asking, how does a school tell the stories of racial justice in a way that leads to change? That is a powerful story. And as we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. Or what happens when there are competing narratives? That is a reality. And we're going to talk a little bit about narratives and how this also connects to coherence, the competing narratives leading to coherence in bringing those together to live what we believe. So I think that we have, people need the login number,
There,
39104199. Oh yeah, and my
and
delays.
yeah, I know. And it looks like there's already a number of answers up there. So basically, you can see it at BQI Story Cloud and or bit.ly/BQI Story Cloud. But a lot of words like the story of the last 14 months has been opportunity, has been roller coaster, bewildering, transformative, joys and sorrows, trauma, connected, kind of all over the map, which is not surprising at all. The people that we've been talking to this year in the last few months and throughout the pandemic have been experiencing a range of emotions and a range of stories. Some of them have been really innovative, and others have been very challenging. So it's kind of an interesting moment. There's no question about the way that the world is rolling out, and what that means for us in terms of the way we think about schools and the way we think about stories, right? So what we want to do is we want to just set some context around why story is so important right now, and why our interrogation of story and our thinking about story in our work is crucial to any thoughts that we have about moving forward. And those of you, I know on the chat there, we're seeing a lot of friends of ours, and that we don't want to go back to normal. We think that there were a lot of problems with normal in schools, and so story is one way of pushing forward into creating something different, and that context is really important. So I'm going to take a little bit of time just to talk about all the different contexts that we're situated in right now that inform the way we think about storytelling. First of all, and this is Yuval Harari, who I'm going to quote here again in a second, but we are in between stories, and we talk about this a lot. We look at the world right now in education and in a lot of other institutions and a lot of other kind of histories, and we see traditional ways of thinking beginning to break, but we're not quite sure what is going to replace them. And schools are no exception to this, obviously. But when you look at politics, you look at medicine, you look at media, all of these things are moving from one iteration, one sense of what they are that's been around for quite a long time, to something that's going to be very different, but we're not exactly sure what that is. And that's a hard moment to be in. Some people call that a hinge moment. We talk a lot about it as a liminal moment where we're kind of, in between going down this hallway, and we're not really sure what the destination looks like or what the destination is, but we know that we're in this movement period where things are changing around us. And so there is a lot of disillusionment and there's a lot of anger. And when old traditions break and new ones begin to replace them, it's very unsettling and it makes us very, very uncomfortable. But there's no question, too, that what's happened in the last 14 months has taken a lot of these narratives and stories that are beginning to crack a little bit and accelerated them, pushed them forward. When you think about all the things that we've been dealing with, not just the pandemic, obviously, but that probably was the most challenging moment in many of our lives, one that as societies and as communities we had to face together and are still facing and struggling through. But then you have the social and racial unrest that came with the George Floyd murder and continues today in the headlines as you see more examples of the injustice and inequity that's happening around the world and in the United States. It's a huge stress right now on trying to figure out how do we get to a place that looks different from the enormous inequity that we have right now. Democracies around the world are actually in decline. And when it comes to the amount of freedom that people have, the amount of voice and agency that people have, and obviously we have this looming climate threat that is already not just at our doorstep, but it's in the house right now, as we like to say. We don't like to say that, but as the reality is that's where it is. And so we have all these kind of existential contexts that we have to be dealing with when we think about story, when we think about the stories that we want to tell. And all of those things have accelerated the story, has accelerated the change. And I love this quote by Scott Galloway in a book called Post Corona, where he talks about, well, what's the world going to look like? He says, any trend, social, business, personal, it has been fast forwarded by 10 years. And in schools, I think we see this pretty obviously when it comes to technology, especially. We're doing things today with technology in most schools that would have normally taken probably 5, 6, 7 years to get to, but they were compressed, and the challenge that we were met with of moving school online forced us to learn, to upskill, to really dive into technologies in ways that maybe we weren't comfortable with in the past. Now, that nihilist moment, that real difficult moment that Harari was talking about a second ago, a lot of that tension comes from the difference between the larger narratives or arcs of the stories or arcs of the change, and then the stories that drop out of that, right? So I think you would agree right now, the narrative of media is changing really quickly. It looks nothing like it did even 5, 10 years ago. I've been hearing a lot about, movie theaters. What's going to happen to movie theaters? And the whole narrative is suggesting that we're watching all that stuff from home on our devices, that they may be obsolete, whatever else, right? So the larger narrative of change is moving very quickly. The stories, however, that we hear, those individual examples of what's actually happening, when those stories that we're listening to don't comport to the narrative, right? That's when there becomes a lot of tension. And in education, that is exactly what's happening right now, because the stories that we're telling in education are not mapping to the larger sense of change that's happening in the world when it comes to the way we think about schools and learning. So basically, you get headlines like this one, private schools have become truly obscene. This was in the Atlantic about a month ago. And it's this just hard push against the entitlement and the perceived inequality that come along with being in independent schools, and how the story of independent schools in many cases right now is out of sync with the larger narrative, the larger arc of education in schools, which we'll talk about here in a second. You have teens that are saying, do we really want to go to college? I mean, is this really the path that we want to take? Because in many cases now that path of college feels out of sync. It doesn't feel like it's the most viable or valuable path forward. I added this slide actually just this morning before we did this session, where now a new poll shows that half of parents don't want their kids to go straight to a four-year college. I mean, think about that. There's a huge dissonance in the ways that people are perceiving the stories that we're telling in schools and the narratives. And then this one I think is just so example. It's such a great example of what we're talking about. In Black households, the proportion of homeschooling increased more than fivefold because of the pandemic, 16.1% from 3.3% in a 3 to 5 month span. And a lot of those kids are not going to go back. A lot of those kids are going to be living a very different kind of story than they were in the past. So, we're at the point now where a lot of people are questioning all of it. And they're saying, what if everything we believe about education is a lie? Now, this is a little bit of a hyperbolic title and it's a little bit of clickbait, but it's still a question that a lot of people are beginning to ask now. How is there resonance between the lived experience in schools and the larger sense of what our kids need to be able to do in order to thrive in their worlds? So the narrative of education, the arc of education is changing. I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? So the traditional narrative of education is that basically, go to school, you play by the rules, you work hard, you get good grades, you get good test scores, you go to a good college, and you get a good job. And basically, that's the path forward. And in that narrative, education is something that is explicit. It's clearly defined what it is. It's competitive, and basically it's something that's required. If you don't have an education, you can't aspire to the best jobs, to the best salaries, etc. But that narrative is shifting. There's this kind of new narrative of education that is emerging right now. And basically it says, you know what, you can kind of create your own school. You can develop your own passion. You can learn how to learn. You can develop the skills you need to be successful, and you can find and solve real problems. And in this narrative, education is becoming more tacit. It's not something that someone else defines for you. It's something that you cobble together. You put it together as you need to learn the things that are interesting or important to you. It has impact, and it's collaborative, and it's something that you want. It's something not that you necessarily have to have a paper or something, but it's something that you build this kind of educational expertise around something that's really interesting to you. And I have to say, I'm living this with my daughter right now, who is basically pursuing a path where she is absolutely educating herself, because in many ways that's what this moment affords, right? So now you get some different stories dropping out of that, right? Google's new career certificates, basically a fraction of the cost. And Google has said, if you do one of these certificates with us, we will value it as much as we have valued college degrees in the past. You look at Coursera, thousands of courses that people are taking. I spoke to someone just the other day who said he'd been just kind of upskilling, taken 3 Coursera courses. In fact, I think he's on this call right now, or 2 or 3 Coursera courses. And he said it was just like a very fulfilling and it was a great opportunity to continue to learn. You look at credentials, which are really interesting, right? Because if you're gonna be able to do an education on your own, quote unquote, then someone's gonna have to kind of credential it and say, yeah, those things that you're cobbling together are worth it. Well, guess what? We have almost 1 million credentials in this country, just in the US right now. And you wouldn't have 1 million credentials if people weren't basically looking at them and saying, yeah, that's valuable work, and assigning some type of value to the work that you're doing. Now, a lot of this is beginning to shift at a national level. And one of the places that we talk about a lot is Taiwan. And Taiwan has basically moved from this idea of competition to this idea of collaboration when it comes to the way they think about education. So education for a global citizenry, intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. Students design their own curriculums, teachers as co-learners, well-being of students, innovation, sustainability, inclusion, and innovation are the rough consensus across generations of what a lifelong learner should focus on. that's a different story. That's a different way of then rolling out what an education is and what its meaning is. So it really is important for us to understand these contexts, because if the stories that we're telling in our schools are in dissonance with the larger arc of how things are changing in the world, then that creates a lot of tension. And so we're in that moment right now. And we have to build people's capacity to understand. We're going to talk a little bit about this later, but we have to build people's capacity to understand these new contexts in order for them to accept the new stories that we want to begin to tell. And so one of the ways that we get into that is we start talking a little bit about coherence.
Right. So when we think of coherence, we really are, it's a little bit of a test pause to make sure, are you living what you're saying? Do you live your values? What are those signals? And so the narratives, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those stories are that our schools tell that often are in dissonance with what we want to be living. And in our work, we have sort of taken that pause and we're leading with questions. And that's how we really came up with our book, The 9 Big Questions Schools Must Answer to Avoid Going Back to Normal, because normal wasn't that great to begin with. And so this idea that normal isn't that great to begin with is acknowledging all these broken systems. And so our 9 questions take a look, sort of probe a little deeper, inquiry-led, fearless leadership, fearless inquiry, to get us to think about how do we live coherently with that story we want to build, with the no normal or the new normal we want to get to. So I'm just going to touch on and just let you all, if you're not familiar already with the book, I'll just show you those questions. But essentially, the idea that the power of questions lies in this fact that questions have the power to make that have the power to make a difference, are the ones that engage people in an intimate way, confront them with their freedom, and invite them to co-create a future possibility. So we essentially are inviting you to co-create with us. And that's one of the powers of story. So our 9 questions, we kick it off with what is sacred. So even as we want to think about the next, the future, the next normal, the no normal, the new normal, whatever you want to call it, we're not advocating to throw everything out. We're really advocating to take stock of what matters. The metaphor of walking through the portal of the pandemic says, what do you want to carry with you through the portal? And that's everything that you consider to be sacred. And so you go down this list, you have to ask these big questions. What is learning? Where is the power? Why do we fill in the blanks? So many things that we do, we don't question. Who is unheard? Are we literate? Are we okay? Pointing to the wellness questions that we really haven't seen asked as intensely until the pandemic. Are we connected? And then what's next, looking to the future. So just in the context of story, rather than go into all these questions, which we do in many other occasions, we just want to have one of the questions stand out that is particularly important in the context of story, and it is, who is unheard? Whose stories are we leaving out of the equation? Do we ask enough, who belongs in the story? Don't we all belong in the story? And how do we show up? So some scholarship from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, where she discusses the idea that if you take a selfie among friends, the first thing you usually do is stop and take a look at that phone or whatever the camera was and look for yourself in the picture. And if you time after time after time find that maybe you are erased out of the picture, as is, basically the metaphor for our curriculum, our leadership, so many things that happen in schools, how do you start to feel? You start to feel like, I don't belong. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I don't deserve to be in the picture. Maybe I did something. And you're questioning yourself, you're questioning your worth, you're questioning if you belong. And that's not right. And so we need to reframe who is unheard, who belongs in the story, because this is happening every single day. This is part of why there is a 500% increase in Black families opting to homeschool, because it doesn't feel good to not feel like you belong. Another side of the storytelling in Who is Unheard comes from this West African proverb. The lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. Now, the lion is a fantastic, incredible species. But if we only focus on the story of the victor, the hunter, in a sort of competitive, zero sum landscape, we never get to hear the lion's story. And in many ways, that is what is playing out in our schools. And we are not richer for that. We are losing out when we don't get to hear the lion's story. So it's really important that in order to be able to tell the news stories, because we get to pick the stories that we're going to tell, we have to know what our current stories are. So let's look at a little bit of what are our stories. And this is one of the places where it's not only fearless inquiry, but I think it calls for some radical candor, some really deep truth telling. What is the story that we're actually living?
So we're going to put you through a little bit of a story audit. That's what we call it. And it's one way of that maybe you can right now do some reflection back to the aspects of your school that tell a particular story. Because the reality of it is that everything you do in your school tells a story. Every single thing you do, every line item in the budget, every policy in the handbook, every interaction that you have with children, all of it combines to tell a story. And the question becomes, do you know what that story is? Do you know who's telling it? And what do you do about the answers to those questions? So, the way you set up your classrooms tells a story. I know that both Home and I have had the chance to visit lots of different schools. And when we walk through the hallways, even if we're not talking to anybody, we can pick up pretty much what the story is, especially when it comes to like the power story that's happening in schools. It's pretty easy to suss out what the power relationships are just by kind of looking in classrooms. Every email that you send tells a story. I'm going to give you a personal example. This is from a few years ago now, but this stuck with me because the opening day email to my son when he was a senior in high school came through. And, opening day emails for seniors, you would think that that would be something along the lines of, we are so excited to have you back. This is going to be the best year ever. We've missed you. We've made all these improvements. No, the focus of the first day welcome back email was, we're looking forward to starting the school off on a right foot. So be sure to review the dress code policy. And that tells a story without question. When you walk down the hallways, what signs do you see? What kind of story is being told there? When you look out on the athletic fields and you see the multi-million-dollar jumbotron, what story is that telling? What is that saying to people about what you find, what you hold important, what you prioritize? When you basically try to move your entire school curriculum and practice online in a matter of weeks and basically try to replicate what you've done, in the classroom, that tells a story. And that's been a really interesting story that many schools have told in the last 14 months or so. When you decide, because your students are asking for it, that you create a transgender bathroom, that's an interesting story. That says a lot about what you hold important and what you, again, prioritize in your schools. When you see YouTube videos of students who are basically helping other students get the highest score they can on those IB tests, on that diploma exam, and then also how to kind of like deal with the results when you don't necessarily, get the ones that you wanted, then that obviously is a story that you're telling. And finally, when you publish in the local paper a list of where every kid gets accepted to school, and then you have a small little box in the bottom left that says other, which I think is really interesting. And if you look down there, I feel really bad for Hannah Lowe, who is the only undecided student in this entire list of kids. And imagine the story that this tells. And by the way, that may be the story that many of your real estate agents in your towns are telling, and they are among the most powerful storytellers in your communities without question right now. So let's just remember, and our kind of reminder to you is that you need to know what stories you're telling. And part of beginning to tell new stories is understanding what stories are already being communicated. And so doing an audit is crucial. And there are lots of ways that you can begin to do this. But basically, however you do it, it's making sure that you're talking to your constituents and you're looking at the signals that you're putting out, some of which you may not even know that you're putting out there. So we're going to shift into two more little sections here. And this is we're going to try to hold this to about 10 or 15 more minutes. And if you have some questions that you might want us to talk about, you can put them in the chat on YouTube. But the kind of other piece of this now is once you've figured out what stories you're telling, then you need to know what story you're aspiring to and what aspiration you have, and then you can pick which stories move you toward that aspiration. So just a quick example that I thought was really funny. This is from the 1958 World's Fair, published in the Chicago Tribune. Imagine this is 62 years ago, and I happen to know that for some weird reason. Um, this is a picture of what people imagined the future to be. And basically, it's a future of sound movies and mechanical tabulating machines. People would record attendance and answer questions by push buttons. Special machines would be geared for each individual student so they could advance as rapidly as their abilities warranted. Progress records would be kept by machine, would be reviewed by skilled teachers, and on and on. And the irony here is that, of course, except for the guy in the helicopter there, up in the top right, this isn't far away from what the Zoom classroom looks like. It's very close to what has ended up happening in a lot of schools right now. And the question I think that's interesting is that is this the future that we would have written? Is this really the where we are right now? Is that the future that we would have written 20, 30, 40 years ago? Would we have agreed with this conception of the future? And that's the question we have to ask. What is the future that we want to write, that we want to create? What does that story look like? And how does that connect to the larger narratives that are happening out there?
So that kind of points to this lovely idea that we have been thinking a lot about, writing the history of the future. And what that really points to is this fact that it's a wonderful exercise to get to perhaps imagine in the year 2040. Let's think about what 2040 is going to look like and sort of work backwards from there. How did we get to that point? What were some of the factors? What are some of the scenarios? And in the futures thinking work that we do, where we help schools do scenario planning, that is part of the exercise. It is an exercise in sort of unsticking the mind, and it involves, but it involves imagination as much as it involves a very deliberate practice and action that is rooted in some sort of tangible skills. And as we embark on a process of writing the history of the future, of understanding our contexts, our commitments, where we are at in this moment, to take you through that process, we like to think of a framework that we've developed around three important R's, and they connect to our questions, they connect to this moment. So the first step in the three R's is walk you through a process of reflection. And I think oftentimes in especially Western culture, we are in such a hurry. We lived it, we did it, we're moving on to the next thing. And we don't pause enough to stop and do some very, I think, productive reflection. So that is a bit of the story of the past. And it is an important sort of thinking about where have we been, what matters, what do we assess from the past. So step one in this process is reflection. Step two, we go from past to present, is a reset. And that might be embodied in the question of what is sacred? What do we carry with us through this portal of a pandemic? And where does it take us? And sort of this is the place that kind of situates us in asking the 9 questions. And we have processes in the book. By the way, I don't think we mentioned, for those who don't know, it is a free download that if you go to bigquestions.institute, you'll see there is an icon, a menu item for the free ebook. So that's a free download. Anyone take that book, discuss it with your faculty, with your colleagues, and think about this present moment and how you reset, how you use those questions and sort of the audit activities of those questions to do a reset. And then the third R in these new reset of R's is reinvent. So what is that future that we look forward to? What are the parameters that are important to us now that we've thought about what's sacred, what we carry with us? What might that future look like? And we've put this together in a sort of wonky framework that just you can take a look, that it really centers individuals, community, and institutions, schools. We do not forget the role of the institution or the individual. We do not forget the important role that individuals play, and what matters to us is an important part of the story. And so anchoring in past, present, future, reflect, reset, reinvent, we ask, who are we now? And then what might we become? And so what might we become in redefining roles, reinventing schools, embarking on a process of creating is that reinvention portion. So there's a lot that can be unpacked there, and we're not going to do that right now. But we do want to sort of walk you through a few ideas. I do think the 3 R's sort of anchor us in a process of how we do the storytelling, and it demonstrates a commitment. So to develop an effective practice for writing new stories that support change, our final C in this series is committing, making that commitment to a process. So what might that commitment look like? So a few points, and this is all around how. So we talked about why story, what might the story be, and now how we get there. So clearly articulating your commitment to hearing and telling stories is a vital piece of getting that process starting. Just saying, I am committed to this, especially as a school leader. Another step is to build capacity over time for people to hear new stories and tell new stories. We need to build that capacity. We don't just wake up and have those skills because we've heard of something. Choose wisely. Create a core message that you continue to reinforce. So there are a lot of messages out there. There are a lot of competing stories. What do you want your story to be? What is that core story that seems coherent to your ideals? And make students and teachers the heroes of the learning story. So teachers, I think, to recognize that they are also in a process of learning, but students in particular, centering students as the hero, this sort of hero's journey that we are all on, and that learning is such an important piece of that. Students seeing themselves in the story. And then finally, know your audience. What are their fears, their hopes? How might you craft the story in response to understanding some of the obstacles, some of the big and a lot of existential challenges right now, in particular. So knowing your audience and crafting the message. So your strategy, your strategic plan might be a portion of your story, and that really is um, a reflection of people, right? So that's where you want to reflect all of these elements in the important components, your strategic plan, your budget, your curriculum. Who are those stories for? Who is getting a voice in those stories? What are you telling in that story? Are you living coherently with it? So it's a lot. And I do think this is sort of a reframing of how we think about the articulation of our commitments. And so, in response to that, just we want to invite you all to join us in May and in August. We are going to be running some deeper dive 2-day sessions, storytelling for school change. And so that's when we're going to have a chance for people to begin to write their story of their school, to write the story of their own experience and walk through the 3 R's and these steps that help us get to the how, to think about our context, to think about how we might be coherent with the stories that we're living. And I know I just from the corner of my eye, I see like the YouTube chat is blowing up. So Will, I don't know if you're able to follow what's been happening in the chat and you want to take a few minutes to highlight anything from there.
Yeah, just some interesting questions. And if you have more questions, we'll be happy to stay on for a couple more minutes if there's a little bit of discussion that you want to have. But love the idea that you have that student stories are that you're putting together student stories. I think, and I know Homa would agree that when stories are told through the eyes of students and specifically through the eyes of learners, and I was just, I was kind of trying to be a little bit of a provocateur in the chat as well when Meg said, the learner as the hero. I think that's really important. I wonder if that's different from the student as the hero though now. And
Mm.
I think a lot of the stories that are being told in schools right now is the student as the hero. And I do think that there's a little bit of difference in that. And I think it's one that's worth kind of unpacking a little bit. I'm not saying that we shouldn't tell stories about students, but I do think that in many cases, those aren't the same as telling quests about learners who are dealing with problems and solving challenges and all of that. I will tell one quick story that we didn't put in here, but a couple of years ago, and this kind of speaks to what I just said. A couple of years ago, I was working with a principal up in Massachusetts, and we were talking about storytelling and the ways in which the messaging is so important when you're trying to bring change into your school or into your district. And he said at one point, he just said, look, I've decided that, I really can choose the stories that I tell. And so on my blog, I used to be telling a lot of stories about kids, reaching all these achievements and scores and whatever else. And he goes, I've just come to the conclusion it's great if you're a national merit semifinalist, but that's not going to find any space on my blog anymore. That's not the story that I'm going to choose to tell about the learning that's happening in my school. And I thought that was really powerful, that you do have a choice. And again, to recognize that what you decide to choose is in many cases going to be heard as the story that you're promoting. So you have to be aware of how that's being heard and how that's being interpreted by the people in your community. Home, I don't know if you're seeing anything.
Yeah, I'm seeing Jamie Roundtree's comment, how do we address the opportunity gap for Black and Brown
Yeah,
families
it's a
as we
great,
think about writing
great
the history of
question.
the future? And then this is an opportunity for the redistribution of educational opportunity wealth. Um, Absolutely. Gloria Ladstone Billings talks a little bit about this misnomer of the opportunity gap, and she says we should really think of it as a debt, as an educational debt that we really owe families who have been left out of the opportunities. And I really do think story is a way to not only address who is unheard, but to celebrate so that it isn't so deficit and scarcity centered, but to celebrate stories and gifts and heritage and genius that is there and we have been missing out from. And so I think when we begin to frame the stories of our schools in a way that includes all of our families, our stories are richer. And that is one of the benefits of this approach.
Yeah, and I think that's why, again, that who is unheard question is so important for us. Because in many cases, I'm not sure that we know even who isn't being heard in the stories that we tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Homa, we had a couple glitches there,
Yes,
some technology issues, but
it
hopefully
happens.
those of you who stuck with us, hopefully that was worth your time, and we appreciate you coming to let us share some of our thinking and learning with you. And you know where to find us if we can ever help you in your journeys, and please feel free to connect with any questions or comments about today's session. So,
Yes.
any
And
final words from you?
yeah, I wanna lift up our friend Jonathan Regan in the chat is inviting everyone to celebrate a silver lining story from your community. Please share those stories. So on our BQI community, which I don't know, maybe will, is it
I
just
just put that in.
bqi.community?
Yep,
Okay. So
bqi.community, I'll get you there. Yep.
bqi.community is the domain. Go in and share some of these stories, and there is a space for those silver lining stories, because certainly that's the other power of story. It really lifts the spirit, and we need that right now.
All right, everyone, be well. And
Thank you.
if you like this and you want to watch it again without any technological interruption, fingers crossed, we're doing it again at 7 o'clock tonight. And tell your friends that they still have an opportunity if they want to see it. So thanks very much, everyone. Really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
And be well.
Thanks, everybody.